Likewise, a deterioration in the country's terms of trade does not necessarily harm the country. First, let's define deterioration. This is when export prices are decreasing relative to import prices. A deterioration in the nation's terms of trade occurs when the terms of trade value decreases. Let's now outline the impact that a deterioration in the nation's terms of trade would have on the nation's economy. Now again, we must consider price elasticity of demand here. So depending on the PED for exports and imports, a deterioration in the terms of trade could move the current account, in other words, net exports, towards surplus, in this case, if demand is elastic, or towards deficit if demand is inelastic. If a nation's export prices are falling relative to import prices, this could benefit the nation if foreigners are highly responsive to the country's now cheaper exports. So if demand is elastic, the current account could move towards surplus. This is because even a slight decrease in the price of the nation's exports could lead to a large increase in the quantity demanded by foreign consumers. At the same time, if the price of imports is rising relative to export prices and demand is elastic, then domestic demand for imports will decrease by proportionally more than the price of those imports increased. So in this case, if demand is elastic, then a deterioration in the terms of trade could actually move the country's current account and net exports towards the positive. On the other hand, if demand is inelastic and export prices decrease, then foreigners will not respond by increasing their consumption of those exports by a very large quantity. So in fact, inelastic demand and a deterioration in the terms of trade could move the nation's current account balance and its net exports towards deficit. So it's not black and white here. Improvement does not necessarily mean the country is better off, and deterioration does not necessarily mean the country is worse off. That's a very important point when evaluating or analyzing the effects of a change in a country's terms of trade. Improvement will only actually improve the level of output in the country if demand for that country's goods is inelastic among foreign consumers and demand for imports is inelastic among domestic consumers. A deterioration in a country's terms of trade can actually improve the level of aggregate demand in the country if foreign consumers' demand for that country's exports is elastic and if domestic consumers' demand for imports is elastic. On the other hand, a deterioration will actually worsen the current account balance if foreigners do not respond highly to the lower price of the country's exports, or if domestic consumers do not respond highly to the higher price of imports. This brings us to the final part of today's lesson. We need to talk about some possible reasons for a change in a nation's terms of trade. We're going to outline 4 possible factors here that can cause a nation's terms of trade to either improve or deteriorate. There are many other factors that can cause terms of trade to change, but for the sake of time, we're only going to focus on these 4 in this lesson. First is a change in the demand for a country's exports. So we'll look at one side of the situation here. If there is increased demand for a nation's exports, then the price of those exports will rise and the terms of trade will improve. Now this naturally will increase AD in the nation. On the other hand, if foreigners demand less of a country's exports, then the laws of supply and demand dictate that export prices will fall and the terms of trade will deteriorate. Changes in the supply of a country's exports can also affect the nation's terms of trade. So increased supply of a nation's output, in other words, short-run aggregate supply, which is a concept learned in macroeconomics, may arise due to increased productivity or lower production costs in the nation, will lead to a deterioration in the terms of trade. In this scenario, however, a deterioration in the terms of trade could actually be good for the country because the lower export prices are the result of improved productivity and economic growth domestically. So this deterioration would actually be accompanied by an increase in national output and an increase in national income. On the other hand, if there was a negative supply shock resulting from higher energy prices, perhaps stronger labor unions or a higher minimum wage, a negative supply shock would cause domestic prices to rise due to cost push inflation, which would cause an improvement in the terms of trade. An improvement in the terms of trade in this case could actually be bad for the nation because it's accompanied by negative output and higher domestic inflation. So once again, the terms improvement and deterioration are not exactly black and white. We must look at the circumstances leading to the changes in the terms of trade before we determine whether it's good or bad for the country as a whole. There could be external factors that lead to a change in a country's terms of trade. For example, if a country is a commodity exporting nation, it may experience wild fluctuations in its terms of trade as the prices of the commodities that it produces fluctuate on global markets based on the level of global economic activity. Commodity exporters tend to experience more wild fluctuations in their terms of trade than countries that produce more manufactured goods, whose supplies and demands are more responsive to price changes, and therefore price changes are less frequent and less volatile than they are for primary commodities. A way a country can minimize the impact of fluctuating commodity prices on their terms of trade is by diversifying their output. So output diversification will minimize these swings in terms of trade and lead to greater macroeconomic stability for a developing country. Less economically developed countries can reduce the fluctuations in their terms of trade by diversifying their output. This is why countries such as those in Western Europe and North America and East Asia tend to experience more stable terms of trade over time. The variety of goods that they export is very wide. Compared to countries such as Brazil, Russia, the Middle Eastern states, which export primary commodities, they are likely to see their terms of trade fluctuate more dramatically due to the fact that the prices of primary commodities fluctuate based on the level of global economic activity at any given time. The final factor that can lead to a change in a nation's terms of trade is the exchange rate itself. So, not surprisingly, an appreciation of the currency actually improves a country's terms of trade. Of course, the country's exports become more expensive to foreigners. Now, as we learned in a previous lesson, specifically in the unit on the Marshall-Lerner condition and the J curve, in our previous section on balance of payments, an appreciation of the nation's currency does not necessarily improve its macroeconomic conditions. It could actually move the current account towards deficit and reduce aggregate demand of the nation. So once again, an improvement in the terms of trade is not necessarily good for the nation. How this impacts aggregate demand depends on the price elasticity of demand and whether or not the Marshall-Lerner condition is met. I went over these concepts in a previous lesson on my YouTube channel. On the other hand, a depreciation of the currency leads to a deterioration in the terms of trade as the country's exports become cheaper and imports become more expensive. Once again, I'll remind you that a deterioration of a nation's terms of trade is not necessarily bad for that nation. Whether it improves or worsens the macroeconomic conditions in that nation depends on the responsiveness of consumers at home and abroad to the more expensive or less expensive imports and exports following an improvement or deterioration in the terms of trade. So in this lesson, we have gone over the definition of terms of trade. We've learned the formula for terms of trade. We've walked through several calculations of a nation's terms of trade using the index of export prices and index of import prices in our table here. We've outlined the factors that can cause a change in the nation's terms of trade. And the most important thing I want to conclude with here is just the reminder that the terms improvement and deterioration should not be given values like good or bad. An improvement is not always necessarily good for a nation, and a deterioration is not always necessarily bad for a nation. The responsiveness of consumers at home and abroad to the change in the price of exports and imports will ultimately determine how aggregate demand, output, inflation, and employment in a nation are affected following a change in its terms of trade.
Here we go.